Hello, everyone, and welcome to our community tour led by Katharina Kafka. My name is Michael Magnuson. I'm the Public Program and Outreach Coordinator at the Art Gallery of Alberta. To start this program, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. I'm currently in Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton, the traditional land of diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Inuit, and Ojibwe Saulteaux Anishinaabe. We acknowledge and extend gratitude to the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for generations and who continue to call this place home today. This is the 6th edition of our community tour program, which invites a new speaker each month to lead a tour of a current exhibition, giving our audience a unique perspective on the artwork on display. We are going to be looking at the exhibition Cornelia Hahn Oberlander, Genius Loci, which is currently on display at our gallery till the 17th. So if you haven't seen it yet, please check it out because time is running out. One thing to mention is that we will have a chat at the end of this lecture. And so if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A function, or you can also use the chat function. And if you are on Facebook, please enter them in the chat. This AGA Live community tour is made possible in part through the support from the Heart and Soul Fund by EPCOR. I would also like to thank the Canada Council for the Arts for their support as well. Now, I would like to introduce Katharina. Originally from Vienna, Katharina attained a Master's of Landscape Architecture from the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna, Austria in 2002. Katharina has over 15 years of experience as a landscape architect and works within the full range of scale, from master plans and pocket parks to civic spaces and private yards. Katharina believes the design of exterior space has not only an important impact on a building, but is essential to the feel and making of place. Her designs are deeply rooted in their neighborhoods and their natural and historic context. So without further ado, please welcome Katharina.
So hi everyone and good evening and thanks for joining us today. I'm Katharina Kafka and I'm a landscape architect, and I've been a landscape architect all my adult life. I was born and raised in Austria and worked in Europe a while and then came to Canada, to Edmonton about 12 years ago. I first learned about Cornelia Hahn Oberlander maybe like 15 years ago, and I was working in Ireland at the time and planning a trip to visit an old friend in Vancouver. And a colleague of mine, also originally from Germany, said to me, "Oh, you're going to Vancouver, you must go and visit Cornelia Hahn Oberlander." And I didn't even know who she was at the time. So then I started to do some research, look up her projects, and I went to Vancouver and had a fantastic time in Vancouver. However, I got shy and I did not contact her. She must have also been in her 80s back then. Time was short, but didn't matter. Ever since, I felt very connected to her and to her work. And you know how it is when you put your awareness towards something, suddenly she popped up everywhere, and there was this project and that project. And yeah, so I feel very much connected to her, and I think not only because of our common Germanic heritage and finding our homes in Canada, but also just because of her work and how excellent her work is and how influential she has been. So it's a great honor for me to be here today and share a bit of my view and thoughts about her work. So thanks a lot, Michael, for inviting me and having me here. So this exhibition is called Genius Loci, which is Latin for the spirit of a place. And that's actually a really beautiful underlying principle of landscape architecture, and I suppose also of architecture. And it means like to read the spirit of the place, and that every place is unique, every project is unique, every site. And so there's obviously the site location, there's the fauna, there's the flora, there's the topography, there's the usage, there's the history, and all of that forms a certain ambience, a certain spirit that touches us and moves us and can inspire us. So I think that's been a really underlying principle to her work, that she really worked with the land and the place and its uniqueness. And you will, as we walk through the exhibition now, I think we will see that in a lot of her work. Just quickly before, I just wanted to touch on her biography. I think many of you will know that Cornelia was born in Germany in 1921 into, I think, rather intellectual, open-minded Jewish family. Her father was an engineer and her mother was a horticulturist. So from very early age, Cornelia was exposed to gardening, to botany, the importance of plants. And I think at the age 11, she already decided that she would like to become a landscape architect. And obviously, she also grew up in the times of the Bauhaus and the beginnings of modern architecture and design. And I think that really influenced her for the rest of her life as well. So then in 1938, her father, tragically, he passed away in an avalanche. And then her mother, her sister, and her fled the Nazi government and immigrated to the United States in 1938. And she then moved on to Smith College and studied a combined course, landscape architecture and architecture. And from then on, she went to Harvard, and she was one of the first women admitted to Harvard School of Design. And that was led at the time by Walter Gropius. So here again, she landed in the center of the Bauhaus movement and modernism, and collaboration and studio, and really an overall perspective on buildings and sites and planning. I want to go to her first, and then she graduated in 1947 from Harvard. And she started working in the social housing sector. She started to work for a landscape architect, Dan Kiley. It was just after the war, and so housing was in big demand in Philadelphia. And this is just a sketch, but it immediately is a beautiful, like in my view, it's a beautiful painting because it's all one. It's like there's not the buildings and then there's the landscape architecture or the site or the planting. It really stands out as one composition. And throughout her whole life, I think that was another underlying principle of hers. She used to say, building and landscape must achieve a fit. So they have to go together. And that starts with collaboration, with a strong concept, to the grading plan. And so this was a large housing project. These buildings here are actually, I think, 17, 16 story high apartment buildings. And these are more like mid-rise dense housing units. And just looking at the sketch, I can immediately see like a hierarchy of planting, like nestling the building in between the trees. You can also see a large common space, so common areas, also kind of semi-private areas that she had here. They had vegetable gardens, they had small play areas in there. So you can also see the very rectangular shapes of the buildings, and then she has like just hinted here typical oval of kind of like to have this touch of modern landscape architecture in here. Lots of pedestrian connections. And first I thought these things here are hedges, but then I read that she actually repurposed the masonry of buildings that used to stand on the site and created little walls to delineate her landscape and her semi-private areas. And I think that's a beautiful example of how kind of stay true to the genius loci of the place and repurpose something and keep it and let that live. The next housing, this is another housing project in Philadelphia. And I think this was 6 city blocks, like huge. She also worked with Dan Kiley. And you can see here in orange, I noticed that when walking the exhibition, this is actually specifications. And I never questioned specifications. That was always kind of part of what we do and our job. But actually at the time, they were just the first times people wrote specifications for landscape architectural jobs. And these were the first specifications she ever wrote. As I move forward, you can also see, like, it's a bit blurry, but one can tell, like, her very analytical thinking. She has not in her plant list, not only does she have trees and shrubs and ground covers, but she also discerns between trees and small trees, and she uses them, and she again has kind of like open community spaces. And then it's hard to tell, but I think every ground floor unit has its own kind of open space. So very kind of social responsible planning. I think both Mill Creek and this housing project, Chilkill Falls, have only been partly realized, and they have also been demolished. Then that was something that really amazed me when I walked through the exhibition. I mostly knew her public, like kind of her public space projects, but I wasn't aware of her playground design and how many playgrounds she did and what she did. So she had the opportunity to design a playground for a vacant lot in Philadelphia as well. She did a beautiful site analysis, I think typical to her and thinking of the time, when she also really looked at the demographic and who lives in the neighborhood and what age the children are and what they would like to do. And she really already at that playground started to design her own equipment and her own ways, and she really inspired imaginary play. So this is the only thing I found dated in the exhibition is this play equipment, but other than that, it's amazingly contemporary. So if I zoom in here, you can see she designed a little mountain out of concrete, using concrete, as you can see in the picture. And that's just like really inspiring because it allows for so much creative use. You can climb up, you can obviously run around, every step could become something different. It's seating, it's play. She also differentiated into a smaller children's play area than older children's play area. And then she allowed for a lot of sports. So you can read here, basketball and volleyball and bocce ball and all interplanted, and some seating areas here. She also repurposed equipment. So she really wanted to design a place, a community place for everyone, I think, and move away from very playground equipment oriented play. And that became even much bigger in this project of hers. So she got invited to design a playground for Expo 67 for the Children's Creative Center. And so Expo 67, I think, was in the spirit of kind of like an utopia living and moving a little bit away from the automobile dictated cities. And she got invited to kind of design the most progressive playground with the most progressive play equipment at the time. And what Cornelia did is she designed a play equipment. She designed basically a natural playground. And I don't know how many of you are kind of have children or familiar with education trends at the moment, but natural playgrounds, I think that's really, really, really big at the moment. And I was amazed to see her do it in 1964 when she designed it for the Expo 1967. So instead of typical play equipment, she has hills, she has logs, she has even a kind of stream area running around here. She has resting areas, she has loose play equipment where kids can actually build their own houses and structures and move things around. And she also has a lot of planting, trees. She knew that this playground is going to be mainly used for urban kids, children growing up in cities, and she really wanted to introduce also kind of a natural growing and nature learning into these playgrounds. And she never saw, it was never, I think for a playground for her, it was never just to add items of a catalog. It was really to create a space and an environment and have something for everyone and tell a story. And it's very beautiful, in my opinion, very beautiful. Just the drawings are almost a piece of art. It became highly successful. They had to, apparently, I think they had to limit the times to 1 hour of each kid staying before they ushered them out. And she moved on to design 70 playgrounds all over Canada after that. And so, yeah, here you can see this beautiful sketches, beautiful perspectives she did. There's an embankment slide. I mean, this is now very common in every playground. A log tunnel. Yeah, very highly creative play. So for a long time, nature playgrounds or natural materials weren't allowed. The city of Edmonton didn't allow that for the playgrounds here. Also because in the past they've been treated with kerosene or had splinters. But maybe some of you know, just like last year, they built the first natural playground in the city of Edmonton, in the River Valley by the zoo. And it's a highly successful project, a very beautiful playground. And so I think we'll just see many more of these come in the near future. So this is in 1953, Cornelia married her husband, Peter Oberlander, who was a planner and architect at UBC, and she moved with him to Vancouver. And this is a project, this is another housing project she did in Vancouver called Skeena Terrace. And this one is still here today, still lived in. And even just this sketch again, it shows a nice, it's just such a nice composition of the buildings here, the green spaces in between, how she uses, for instance, lines of trees to create a little bit more of a quieted kind of semi-private space here. Now other spaces are much more open, and there's also playgrounds in here, a strong hierarchy, like it all is like in this one buildings and site. Private gardens and private estates. So over the course of her lifetime and work, she has built many private estates. And I think in the private estates, you can really also see her, like everything comes together. She usually worked with well-renowned architects and mid-century modern buildings, and she could use her incredible plant knowledge and botany. She really also in the very beginning mainly used native plants and maybe a few exotic plants in planters just as a point. And yeah, a lot of her kind of design, almost poetic design work is apparent, I find, in her private estates. So this is, for instance, a sketch for the Friedman estate, which she did in the 50s. And yeah, you can see this area here that's a little bit shaped like a butterfly. It says lawn on it. And I think it later must have turned into gravel. So I learned that there was bedrock underneath. And she didn't want out, and so nothing would grow on that. But she really didn't want to bust out the bedrock because it's beautiful to have bedrock there. And so she just made it work in the design and had nothing planted here, but then had her amazing shrub beds around here. And I love how she has this very rectangular, straight, clean lines, hedges, pathways around the building to match the building. And then she slowly starts to fade it out into the gravel space. And then into her planting. Like a detail like this paver suddenly fading out. This is such a common detail now. You see it in every high-end pavers catalog, and she did it in the 50s. Also, one can see a little bit in the legend here, you know, how 3D, how spatial her thinking was. She didn't really, I think, plan that this is this plant and this, but she went in masses, like these are the shrubs at that height, and these are the shrubs at 16 inches, and then there's the next layer of shrubs, so very layered approach of thinking. This is another residence she did much later in her life, the Rotman residence, that later got expanded. So this here was the original plan, and I think the main road runs here, and this was the entrance to the house, or house, estate. And then she designed this beautiful succession of gardens, like you can see here. This is very formal, very rectangular. I think it's probably hard surface. And then these steps down to a much softer but still geometric kind of ellipsoid, probably lawn area towards the road. She has a row of small trees, but I love the imbalance. She doesn't have it on the other side. There's more steps. And then here it becomes very natural, a birch grove. And so it becomes from very formal to more and more and more natural, to a walk through the forest. It's just a beautiful concept. She had obviously really, really strong concepts that she always followed through. Or like in her famous projects followed through. Then later she got commissioned to add an extension. And so this is confusing because this line of the house here, is the garage here, is actually that line of the house and the garage here. But what you can see, as she got more space to expand here, she pulled the roadway or the driveway away from the building, with a swoosh into the garage, and suddenly could add much more of a parkland landscape setting here, and then continued with her oval theme. It's a very beautiful conceptual approach. Okay, trying to get to the next slide. Yeah, so this is Monteverdi Estates. These are 20 homes. It's a residential project nestled on a slope with views to the ocean, I think, in Vancouver. You can see how beautiful she designed this curving road, and it's an old growth, I think it's in an old growth forest, how she kind of weaved the pathway through the forest. And then all the buildings are set close to the road as to minimize disturbance. And I think they also found a lot of bedrock in between the buildings, and they didn't remove it, and they left it as natural delineation. And I find it also quite poetic that her road then narrows and becomes a pathway through the woods. I think this is a project she did with Arthur Erickson. And Arthur Erickson and Cornelia Hahn, I think, spent 35 years designing together. They were a really good match. They did many, 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 many projects together. So then my next slide. Oh, and this is a very different kind of project she did a little bit later in 2000. This is called Portland Hotel. That is a housing project for people who are hard to house, recovering drug addicts, people who experience trauma. So, and I think this is one of the projects where it's just simply wanted to create an oasis, a healing garden, introduce a lot of planting. I think she has a waterfall to have the noise to soften, create this quiet oasis, meditative space. And as you can see here in her sketches, she looks at it through sections. I find that she has this strong, straight planter bed. She has even a vegetable garden, recognizing the healing nature of planting and growing your own food. And it's all very rectangular. And then she has this beautiful weaving screen through it. So this is one of her later projects. The way she approaches it with sketch, with perspective, with axonometry. So I think it just shows how thorough her work is. So now this is a very, very different scale of project, kind of as an example of her more large scale public projects. This is her tiger garden at the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa. And I find that very revolutionary because you would, like, from a kind of capital, kind of formal, kind of national gallery, I would expect some formally cut lawns, some tulips, some flowers. And she went and she wanted to install a landscape. And she wanted to do something. She wanted to complete an environment, and she wanted to showcase the Canadian North. In fact, she became inspired by a painting, Terre Sauvage, that is hanging inside the gallery by Jackson of the Group of Seven, that depicts the Canadian North. And so she wanted for everyone to have access to the Canadian North. And luckily, they also found rock at early excavations. So she designed this beautiful kind of rock garden with native plants of the Canadian North, with dogwoods, with pines, with irises, and but it's also south facing, so there's an amphitheater, and people can, in these pathways here, meander through this landscape of the north. And this is a plaza here. It's a very strong project, in my opinion. And it also started, or it's the start, kind of the slow start of her phase, where she really used, she called it ethnobotanical planting. So she really wanted to, rather than collecting plants from all over, she really wanted to depict landscapes. That's also very strong in the Museum of Anthropology. This is the Northwestern Territories Legislative Assembly in Yellowknife. And there she took this creating a landscape even further. At least at the time, there was no nursery in Yellowknife. And she also was very clear that she can't just plant some ornamental plants up there, and that she really, really wanted, all she wanted to do is restore the scars of the construction and the impact of construction, as to set this building. It sits just outside of Yellowknife on a beautiful lake, and it looks like it's always been sitting there. Like, it's so beautifully embedded in the landscape, and that's because she just mended the scars. And what she actually did, she asked a botanist and seed collector to come with her, and they collected the seeds of the plants in the surrounding areas and little plugs, and took them back to a greenhouse in Vancouver, and then for 2 years propagated the plants, and then brought them back, and then wherever there was turnover and scars of construction in the rocks, they planted those plants back again. And that's what this project is really famous for among landscape architects. In addition, she also always, I think, connectivity to the greater surroundings. You can see here she worked very thoroughly. She looked at viewpoints, at connectivity. So there's a boardwalk over this lake, I think, to connect into a greater trail system. But she had these thorough site analyses that are really inspiring, you know, where are viewpoints, where are possible resting points, here hierarchy of pathways, and also winter. Like, how is that going to work in winter? What are the winter effects? What can we do to make this beautiful and livable and usable in winter? And that was in the early 90s. And we all know that like the impact of winter, and just the city of Edmonton about 5 years ago published, I think, their winter design guidelines. It's a great document just to have this winter awareness. She did it in the 90s. So very inspiring, very much pushing the status quo again. In the late 80s, she read the Brundtland Report. And that was one of the first reports commissioned by, kind of like, it was one of the first environmental reports that very, very, very clearly stated threats of global warming, change of the environment, and the impact that that will have on mankind. And she read it in the late 80s, and it really resonated with her, and she immediately changed her design practice, and she devoted, I think, the rest of her career, mainly the 90s and 2000s, to as much as she can do environmental, sustainable flagship projects. And one of those is the Vancouver Public Library roof. I mean, this is one, like, we all love green roofs, we all talk about them, they still very rarely get built. But this one was built in 1995, I think. She wanted to have that rooftop accessible. She believed in accessible landscapes that people can use nature. That didn't happen here, but she nevertheless came up with a beautiful design. And the blue fescue in the middle, they depict the Fraser River, and the green grasses, the land, and the Kinnickinnick ground cover, the mountains. And because it was one of the first green roofs, they studied it, and actually only 28% of the rainwater that's landing on the roof is going into the storm water system. So it's also very environmentally successful. later she went on to even design buildings that don't connect to the sewer system. So the last project that I wanted to mention today is a relatively recent project, 3 East Schools, which is a school high up in Inuvik. And I think it just combines many of these underlying principles that characterizes her work. Again, because it's so high up north, they went and they collected the seeds, the plugs, they propagated it. There was a lot of collaboration with the architects in positioning the building, in having it south facing, in mitigating the winds. She designed shelter belts that are not just planted on a grid, but they are planted in groups as to mitigate the winds. And this school is really, like many schools in Indigenous communities, it's really a community building. It's there to be used by the community after hours. There was also a lot of, it has a playground that is made solely, here's the playground and the kindergarten area, that is made solely out of driftwood. So true to her principle of no play equipment other than natural ones on a playground. And then she has a beautiful kind of simple circular area here for Indigenous games and ceremonies, and a lot of shelter belt planting. And I think and also she got very much inspired by berry picking. So most of the plugs and most of the shrubs that are planted are actually edible, because it's also something she really advocated for. And she was very aware that, especially us all living in northern cities, that food security will become a major topic in the future. And as we all know, like the farther north you go, the more impacted by climate change. So the permafrost isn't as permanent anymore. And so it also, I think, really showcases her environmental stewardship. Thank you very much for listening and being with me this afternoon.
Hi, sorry, I just need to unmute myself. Thank you so much for your lecture, Katharina. That was really amazing. We're going to head into the Q&A portion. And before we do that, I just want to say thank you to the Alberta Association of Landscape Architects, and particularly Todd Reed, who has connected us. So that's one of the reasons why Katharina is here, is because we decided to collaborate on this program together. So thanks again to that organization. So if you have any questions, please enter the questions in the chat or on Facebook. And so basically, so while we wait for people to put some questions in, I'm going to ask a question. And my question is a little bit about Cornelia's legacy. Something I noticed during your lecture is that so many of these older projects from the 60s and even from the 70s and 90s, they still seem really relevant and new. Can you speak a little bit about her legacy?
Yeah, it's something that really amazed myself, like how, other than maybe this one playground sculpture, how contemporary her work is. And I think a lot, it goes back to genius loci to really read the place, to really have a site analysis, to really be aware of the needs and use relative simple forms. And I think in general, her approach that form follows function rather than the ornamental borders. It's really the function first. I think that's been highly successful. And also, I think she must have been a very tenacious person. I think she kept pushing. She didn't give up. She didn't settle. She advocated and really was able to push the boundaries. And so much is possible. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that, for me, I want to take away, that to not give up too quickly, mm-hmm. to push especially on a sustainable and environmental, because we all know we are running out of time. So if we don't take the most environmental approach we can take now, when are we going to do it?
Yeah, definitely. I have a question from Carla. And the question is, what's the name of the report that inspired Cornelia to build the Vancouver Library route?
Okay, hold on one second. I wrote it down. It's called, where do I have it? Because I have a mess here. It's called Brundtland, in BRUNDLANDT, Brundtland Report. And its title is Our Common Future. And it was a report of the World Commission on Environment and Development, a global agenda for change. And I think it fell in time with the first World Climate summits.
That's very interesting. That leads me to another question. You briefly, and this might be an aside, but you mentioned green roofs, and we showed the green roof that Cornelia made, and you said something like the fact that they don't get built very often. I was just really curious if you could expand upon that a little bit about green roofs, because that was something that was really intriguing to me when I saw that.
In my opinion, there's only 2 points that speak ever against green roofs, and that's maintenance and cost. And unfortunately, I mean, I'm also very understandably, a lot of our development is cost driven, and then also landscape has this unfortunate element that it's last in the timeline. So it comes at the end of a project, and it's very tempting when you run over budget or run very close to budget to cut landscape or a green roof. It's just one of those things that like I've seen it, like they get really built above parkades. That's a very common application, but there's so much more we could do. And I think we would all love to see it. It's just a matter of prioritizing it, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Because one of the things that we were chatting about is like climate change, and climate change being such a major issue. So speaking from your perspective as a landscape architect, like, is that the number one issue that people are speaking about, or what are the issues in this field that people are concerned with?
You mean like rooftops, the number?
No, just in general, because we were just talking a little bit about climate change, and I'm just curious from your perspective, is that one of the major issues?
Well, I think it's an issue that gives the profession, a lot of the profession of landscape architects, more weight. Mm-hmm. It also might push it a little bit more into the greenery field. I think what I hear, the conversation that I hear a lot among landscape architects, particularly in Alberta, is an element of recognition. It's not, you know, of course, as a landscape architect, in my opinion, major developments should be run by landscape architects and employ architects and planners, but it's the overarching, it's like actually the overarching tying several things together. It's usually the other way around. I think at busier cities like Vancouver, Montreal, they have embraced the public spaces, the public realm. Yeah, I guess I'm talking about the public space much more, but it's also it's a beautiful side effect I'm seeing through the pandemic, but caused by the pandemic, that people embrace the outdoors, they embrace our river valley, they embrace the parks. Every picnic table seems full, and we, you know, I think we used to meet in our little homesteads and our little yards, and now there is a nice embracing of public outdoor space.
Yeah, that's very cool. I'm just wondering, there's another question from Carla, and I'll just read it out. This might take me a little bit of time. I think it's very interesting to see how Cornelia seemed to demonstrate so much faith in her forward-thinking ideas around natural play places and also green roofing. And I wonder if there's any specific way, if you know, that she went about advocating for these cutting-edge ideas. It must have been difficult to change people's existing ideas. Do you have any comments about that?
That's a very good question. I don't know. I'm just drawing an assumption here that she was very well known and very well connected. and she worked with excellent architects who understood her. And I think in that case, she, like, for instance, I think that's why her collaboration with Arthur Erickson was very successful. And so when you have then your architect on board, and then you have, like, then there's again more weight. How she convinced people for the expo, I'm not so sure. And she also used a lot of science to back her up. Like, for instance, I heard that she did a building with Renzo Piano, the New York Times courtyard. And I just heard that Renzo Piano wanted to have birch trees all over the courtyard. And Cornelia said, you can't do that because they will only grow in one certain section. Well, it's very hard to just say to Renzo Piano, you can't do that. So what she did, she commissioned a microclimate study. And then she had this study to really show, look, that's where the daylight falls in. In there's no daylight in your courtyard anymore if it's like high-rise surrounding. And so she made it very clear. I think she backed up her thinking. Like, this is an example that comes to my mind. Yeah. It's not playground specific, but, and I think she was, yeah, I think she didn't hold back to really make her cause.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, from my understanding, it seems like she was always really headstrong with her ideas about
I think so.
what was, yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to give it another minute for any questions.
Okay, hold on. I'm going to turn the light on.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, this has been really nice to learn more about this this exhibition and landscape architecture from your perspective. I'll just have one more question. I'm curious about just like we're seeing all these drawings and I don't know very much about them, but I can see there is a big shift from hand-drawn works to more digital work. Like, can you talk a little bit about like the technology that Cornelia was using in her later projects? Is this technology that architects still use today?
It is and it is not. Like, you can see in her earlier projects, she used a lot of sections. She cut through it. She used sections to draw. It was hand drawn. Later on, it was ArchiCAD, like AutoCAD, like drawn on the computer. And nowadays, I think the move is really towards BIM modeling, building and landscape integrated systems where you don't draw lines and there are a wall. You actually draw a wall and you give this wall character and parameters, and everything is automatically in 3D. That's a little bit more difficult with landscape, and that's also the beauty of it because it's not as like it grows, there's a fourth dimension to it. It's not as quantable as furniture or architecture, but I think people want to see things in 3D, and that's the easiest way. Nevertheless, if you can generate like a certain view in 3D and then you would Photoshop over it, but what I see is a beautiful hand-drawn sketch or perspective can go a very long way. And sometimes what I find, if I personally in my practice draw something very quickly on the computer, it is easily perceived as that's it, that's how it's going to look. And if you use a hand sketch, it leaves open, like it's very clear, this is conceptual, this is schematic, please give me your input. So there's a little bit of a beauty in there too.
Okay, well, that's very cool. Well,
yeah.
Do you have anything, any last minute words you would like to say before we say good evening and goodbye?
Yes, I want to thank you for putting on the exhibition because I think it's just one of the many great ways to bring landscape architecture in general to a greater public. And I think that's wonderful. So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you again for your presentation. And thank you to everyone in the audience for listening. It's been truly wonderful. So I hope everyone has a nice evening. Goodbye for now.
Bye.
Bye.